This is talking about how do you connect with great guests on LinkedIn for your podcast, engage and connect. This example, we're going to go through a few real world examples of how you can best connect with amazing people on LinkedIn to get as great guests. So this one in particular is the CEO of WD-40. And the way you'll see a trend with all of these all these connections, which is give to someone first, engage with them, appreciate what they're doing in their world. And for this particular guest, two guests actually mentioned this person's book on my podcast. One of them is AC. I asked him on the podcast, what are some great books that you like? And he mentioned the book from Gary Ridge. These are great questions. That's why actually we mention in the podcast format, interview format, the final question, because you can ask and you can get resources and you create your own warm introduction. So the guest mentioned his book. So I went to LinkedIn. I mean, it sounded intriguing. I went to LinkedIn and messaged him. This is actually another guest that said, hey, Gary, I was chatting with Chester Elton. Chester also mentioned him when I interviewed him on my podcast, and he was telling me what an incredible leader you are and the culture you have helped create. I look forward to learning more from you, and I just bought your book on Audible. Okay, so I'm letting him know. And then that is May 20th. He didn't respond. And I just mentioned it again. Chester Elton, when I spoke to him, was raving about you. And he didn't respond. And then I asked the question, would you be up for an interview on my Inspired Insider podcast? And I mentioned some social proof elements. Your social proof elements may be different. You can mention social media subscriber or followers. You can mention email. You can mention other guests. I mentioned, for credibility and social proof, I've had the CEOs of Atari, Sega, Mattel, etc. So whatever social proof you have, you can use. He then responded to that and basically gave me his email and said, yes, let's do this. Okay. So I created a warm introduction because guests, you can create it yourself. I could have mentioned him on a podcast, or your guest may create it for you and mention it. So you can do either one. And that would be an example of just reaching out. And we'll go over a few other examples here. All right, John is going to show the next example.
So here's a couple other examples from LinkedIn. So some different types of outreach here. So David Nilsson, this is just a simple example where we have a shared connection, shared community that you're part of. So there's a higher level of trust when that's the case. And I also said something very specific. So it wasn't a generic, like LinkedIn suggested that we connect, or you're in business, I'm in business, let's be in business together, or anything awful like that. He said something very specific. I saw he did an interview where he interviewed Magic Johnson. So I responded to that, and then we engaged in conversation and eventually ended up doing an interview with him. Here's another example. Just interviewed him actually this morning. I had interviewed someone else who had mentioned his name. When I specifically asked that guest about who else does he admire and respect, he mentioned this person's name, Ross Drakes. And so I just immediately sent a message to him and mentioned, of course, the name of that person. And again, that leads to a higher level of trust if you know someone in common by mentioning that person's name. And then ended up interviewing him this morning. It was a great conversation. Here's another example. So the shared component here was people in the same geographic region. So in this case, we're in the same town. I actually was sending out connections to people with particular titles in the same geographic region. You can do the same thing, particular title, same shared geographic connection. It doesn't have to be where you live, by the way. Could be where you went to college, could be somewhere you lived previously. He responded to that. He actually responded. This is the former CEO of California Closets, which was a $300 million a year business at one point. And so, super in demand, busy kind of guy. He suggested we meet up for coffee. The next one here is another one. Again, shared connection, had something in common, and just directly asked her if she'd be interested in being a guest on my podcast. And then finally, Gino Wickman is the author of a number of different books, including this one, Traction and Entrepreneurial Leap. And this was one where I actually created some content that we'd published already. And so a representative of his actually reached out to me, having seen that content that I'd shared on LinkedIn. And then I turned around and said, glad you enjoyed it. I'd love to talk about having Gino as a guest on the podcast, which we did. And Gino's actually referred clients over to us after that, even though we've never actually been a client of his or paid money to him other than maybe buying a couple of his books. So that's a couple of other examples with LinkedIn.
Yeah, so I want to point out a couple common threads here. One, you can create your own warm introductions. Either you mention them, or you have it's someone who your guest actually mentions. Another one is, purchase their stuff, right? Like when if it's an author, I will buy their book on Audible and I'll actually leave a 5-star review for them on Audible, and I'll tell them, hey, I bought your book, left a 5-star review, and I'll actually listen to it. So if it's an important enough contact, you'll go through some of those, go to different links to form that connection, and they know that this is you're genuine and you really appreciate their work, right? And there's other ways to make that real connection that John mentioned. It could be geographic. You're in a group together, or you have a mutual friend, but be real specific with that stuff. And that's what's key, is don't just send a general, hey, I saw you came up in my LinkedIn. Like, actually say something really specific. I want to show you, we also like to do multi-channel, so I wouldn't just depend on LinkedIn. Not everyone, it depends on their behavior, right? John may never go on LinkedIn in his life. So even if you wrote the best message ever, the most specific, he may never read it. So it doesn't matter if you send a message. So just because you don't get a message doesn't mean they read it and ignored it. They could have just never read it. So we're big proponents of multi-channel. One way to do that is, actually go to LinkedIn, and you can message them on LinkedIn. I'm going to share my screen. There's another tool that we use to then email them. Okay. So like, as far as LinkedIn goes, you go to LinkedIn. One of the tools we use is Rocket Reach. So if you go to Rocket Reach, you can actually input someone's LinkedIn URL right here. So if I took someone's profile, I'll do it now, and I plugged it in right here, I could say search, and then they'll come up here, and you can just click get contact and get their email, and then send them an email. Now, when you send them an email, tell them that you messaged them on LinkedIn. So the way that you can, we call it, this is a longer conversation of the non-stalking stalking method, but let them know, if you're messaging them on multiple places, let them know that you emailed them, like on LinkedIn. I emailed you, but I don't know if you ever check email, or, I sent you a message on LinkedIn, but I don't know if you ever check LinkedIn. So it doesn't necessarily seem like you're stalking them. It's a customized message for that platform. So that's what you can do to get someone's email. So you message them on LinkedIn. If they don't respond, you can email them as well. And that's as far as some of the templates you can look at using once you get engaged with the person on LinkedIn. You can actually go to the Rise 25 University and go to the direct ask email, and you can use some of these pieces to then directly ask them to be on your show within the LinkedIn messaging. So there's some examples here of what, when you saw what John included and what I included, it includes, social proof elements. It includes just simply, hey, would you be up for an interview? I would love to feature you on the show. So you can use some of these components of the direct ask email template inside of LinkedIn as well. So that's how you create great connections on LinkedIn that could lead to amazing guests.